Good evening. Welcome to our study in the Gospel of Mark. I will make a note that this is pre-recorded, so I won't be able to respond to your comments real time, but it is live right now, so we can view it at a normal time. Our normal broadcasting for this class will resume next Monday. But I'm glad that you're able to join me this Monday as we continue through the Gospel of Mark. If you want to get your Bibles out, the text will be on the screen, but we are going to be in Mark chapter 8 today. Before that, we'll sing a couple songs as we wait for people to pile in here. I know who holds tomorrow. 463 in the Gray Book. I don't know about tomorrow. I just live from day to day. I don't borrow from its sunshine, for its skies may turn to gray. I don't worry on the future, for I know what Jesus said. And today I'll walk beside him, for he knows what is ahead. Many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. Every step is getting brighter as the golden stairs I climb. Every burden's getting lighter. Every cloud is silver lined. There the sun is always shining. There no tear to dim the eye. At the end of the rainbow, where the mountains touch the sky. Many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. I don't know about tomorrow. It may bring me poverty, but the one who feeds the sparrow is the one who stands by me. And the path that be my portion may be through the flame or flood, but his presence goes before me, and I'm covered by his blood. Many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. Number 457 in the gray. How firm a foundation. After this, we will get into our study. How firm a foundation. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said? You who unto Jesus for refuge have fled. Fear not, I am with thee, O be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and will still give thee aid, all strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand up, held by my gracious omnipotent hand. The soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not desert to its foes. Not so, though all hell should endeavor to shake. Oh, never, no, never, no, never forsake. Amen. Like I said, we've been studying through the Gospel of Mark, and now we come to Mark chapter 8. And so Mark chapter 8 records a lot of the miracles that Jesus had done. So, just in the spirit of review, last time we were talking at the end of chapter 7 how in verses 24 to 30 a Gentile shows her faith. And so we've seen last time how this Gentile had a daughter that was sick, and so she comes to Jesus wanting healing. Well, let me make sure it's her daughter. I believe it's her daughter. Wanting healing for her. And Jesus begins this discussion about how it wouldn't be right to give what is holy to the dogs. But this Syrophoenician woman, as she's described, she says, that's right, but even the dogs eat the crumbs off of the table. So she recognized that she had the faith that she would be grafted in, and Jesus doesn't correct her. And we talked about how that kind of preludes into the Acts 10 with the Gentiles coming in. And so, the verse 25, for a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. So this woman wanted healing for her daughter who's been possessed by an unclean spirit. And Jesus uses that to teach a lesson. He came primarily to the Jews, right? To the Jews first. He came to seek and save the household of Israel, and but slowly the Gentiles are going to be grafted in. They're not grafted in yet, but there's going to come a time that they will be, and we know from Ephesians 2 and Acts 10 that in the church age, Jews and Gentiles are reconciled into one body. So that's cool to see here. And then we looked at in verses 31 through 37 how Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. And what was interesting is the manner in which Jesus does this. If you remember in verse 33, he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue, then looked up to heaven and sighed and said, "Your Father, be open." And so Jesus actually touches the deaf and mute man, and this is significant probably because in that society, this deaf and mute man would be considered unclean. And so Jesus, like we see with the leper, touches him and puts his fingers in his ears and spat and touched his tongue. And so he is touching a person who, under the law of Moses, would be considered unclean. And so that's where we've been last time. Sorry, I shut my notifications off. We shouldn't be bothered. So now we come to chapter 8. And there's a lot of things happening in this chapter. And we see in the first 8, 1 to 10, we see the feeding of the 4,000. Remember previously in chapter 6 and verse 30, he fed 5,000 people, and a similar thing happens here with the 4,000 people. And so, then in verse 8, verses 11 and 12, the Pharisees come to Jesus seeking a sign. And then he uses that in verses 13 through 21 to talk about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. And verses 22 through 24, we see another miracle. 22 through 26, we see another miracle. A blind man is healed at Bethesda, and there's some interesting things there we're going to talk about with that blind man. And when we get to verses 27 to 30, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. And so that is right in the middle of Mark's Gospel. There's 16 chapters. This comes toward the end of chapter 8. I don't think that's an accident. And so we're going to see that. We're also going to see in 8:31 through 33, Jesus predicting his death and resurrection. And in verses 34 through 37, Jesus talks about the cost of being a disciple. We're going to have to take up the cross and follow Jesus. And so there's a lot in this chapter. So let's go ahead and okay. Sorry, checking something. Well, let's go ahead and start with verses 1 to 10. The uh, feeding of the 5,000. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called to him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them come from afar. Then his disciples answered, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, and broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled. And they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came into the region of Dalmutha. And so Jesus is, in chapter 8 begins with a great multitude, maybe likely the same multitude that we read in 7:33. Then he took him aside from the multitude that he healed the blind and deaf man from. And so in those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, so remember, Jesus is popular at this point. This is a great multitude. And so, verse 2, Jesus says, I have compassion on the multitude because they have continued with me 3 days. Now that tells you the commitment that they had to hear Jesus speak. Because 3 days they've continued with him and had nothing to eat. This guy must have had something different. And previously in Mark it was said of him, he taught with one having authority, not as the chief priest and scribes back in chapter 5, I believe it is. And so there's something different about Jesus because the multitude is willing to uh, go hungry for 3 days to follow him. And so Jesus is worried if he sent them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some have come from far. And so he asked his disciples, I think, really a probing question to test their faith. How can one satisfy people's bread? Sorry. The disciples then respond in verse 4. How can one satisfy these people's bread in the wilderness? If you think back in chapter 6, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and still we see that the disciples are still growing. They don't quite understand who Jesus is because they're still asking, how are we supposed to feed these people? Later in verse 8 it says there's 4,000. They're wondering, well, Jesus, we know they're hungry. We know it's been 3 days. How are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to satisfy all these people? And Jesus, similarly to chapter 5, he asked, how many loaves do you have? In verse 5. And they said 7. Jesus asked them what they had. Jesus could work with what they had. And so after that, in verse 6, he commanded the multitude to sit on the ground. I just want to mention, this isn't some magic trick that Jesus is about to perform. And Jesus was just fooling the ground. Fooling the crowd here. This was a miracle. People could attest to the fact that they were there. He told me to sit on the ground. I saw him break the loaves, give it to the disciples after giving thanks. And so they saw these things. It wasn't just Jesus had some loaves in a basket somewhere hidden. This was a miracle that they would have felt, they would have touched, they would have tasted. And so it wasn't some elaborate ruse like some people might claim. And so anyway, in verse 7 it says they also had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he set them before them. And so they ate and were filled. How amazing is that? 4,000 people eating, and it's not like they just ate and said, we don't want to be rude, we're gonna stop, or we can eat more later. It's sufficient for now. They ate and were filled. That really adds to the miracle. 4,000 people were able to eat and be full. And so we have men and women and children, according to some other accounts, and you think about all the different variances of how much a man will eat versus how much a child will eat to get full. And so that really adds to the multiplicity of the miracle. And not only that, they had leftovers at the end of verse 8. And they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Jesus fed these people, they were filled. They didn't just eat the bare minimum to get by, they were full and they had leftovers. And so Mark tells us in verse 9, those who were eating about 4,000, and he sent them away. And then he gets into the boat with his disciples and comes to the region of Dalmutha. But this is an amazing miracle that Jesus is able to do. Jesus is, it's said to have taken, Jesus is able to take 7 loaves of bread and a few fish and feed men, women, and children until they were full. Wow, that is amazing. Jesus has great power. And so, but he is not without opposition. In verses 11 and 12, remember he left the scene. In verse 10, he came into the region of Dalmutha, and then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Surely I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And so this is really comical. The Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him. They were arguing, demanding a sign. And you think about all the signs that Jesus has done to prove who he is. It's really laughable what the Pharisees are asking for. He just fed 5,000 people. Granted, that was in a different region, but they have seen many signs of Jesus, and so Jesus' response in verse 12 then is really understandable. He sighed deeply in his spirit. Why does this generation seek a sign? Or surely I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. They're not going to believe Jesus anyways. Jesus says, I'm not going to give you a sign. I've given you all these things. I've just fed 5,000 people. You see me heal the sick, raise the dead, and now you're asking me for a sign? And Jesus just sighs, and I picture him rolling his eyes saying, come on, guys. But sometimes we're like this. We miss the mark. We give the Pharisees such a hard time with their unbelief. But sometimes It's right there in front of us, and we reject it as well. And so I'm not giving the Pharisees a pass here, but this is relatable. And so we're gonna come back to the idea now, and uh, back to the idea of the miracle in 1 through 10 verses 13 through 21. And so let's go ahead and read that. From verse 13. And he left them, getting into the boat again, departed on the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, It is because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to him, Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive, nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets of fragments did you take up? They said 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said to them, How is it you do not understand? And so he left them, being the Pharisees, and they got into the boat again and departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. That is going to come into play in verse 16. In verse 15, Jesus charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. But remember what they were just doing. They were just in a dispute with the Pharisees over the signs. So Jesus is trying to warn them about the teaching of the Pharisees. Beware of them. Beware of their beware of their teaching. Don't be caught up in it. Don't be deceived by it. But they reasoned among themselves and thought he was just mad uh, uh, about the bread. And so this brings on another discussion. Jesus says, Why are you reasoning about this? Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? That's not what I'm talking about. Is your heart still hardened? Come on, guys, he's saying. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And don't you remember? Jesus is going to call to their remembrance the previous experience at the beginning of this chapter. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of fragments did you pick up? They said 12. And also for the 4,000, how many basketfuls did you take up? They said 7. And he says, how is it you don't understand? Jesus gets frustrated with them because the reasoning among themselves saying it is because we have no bread. He's trying to understand, he's trying to get them to see into the deeper teaching here. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And so their thinking is he just wants bread, oh, we forgot. And Jesus answers that by saying, why are you worried about bread? Didn't you just witness 2 miracles, feeding of the 4,000 and feeding of the 5,000? They totally missed the point. And I can see Jesus going like, come on, guys. But we do the same thing. Jesus had just fed the 5,000 and 4,000, and he draws on that to say, look, if I was talking about bread, I can provide it. I can take you loaf and make it into 5,000. You just seen me do that. Why are you doubting? The apostles are slow, and sometimes we're slow when it comes to developing and coming full circle to the faith. They need to remember what Jesus had just done, and that would bring some clarity. The real issue is the teaching. Jesus can take care of the physical needs, but really he's after the spiritual, and they're just reasoning. Jesus is mad we don't have any food. No. Jesus says, no, don't worry about that. I can take care of it. You've seen. The real concern is you need to watch out for the teaching of the Pharisees. We just have that dispute, guys. You need to be aware of them. You need to be ready to combat them, but they're just not getting the deeper meaning. We need to study the scriptures, not just read them. We need to try and understand the deeper meaning. And so Jesus is going to let them, almost like he has this conversation and lets them think about it. Because in 8:22 through 26, Jesus heals a blind man at Bethesda. And so in verse 22 it says, then he came to Bethesda, and they brought a blind man to him, and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. He looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw everything clearly. Then he sent them away to his house, saying, neither go into town nor tell anyone in the town. And so they come now to Bethesda. And in Bethesda, they bring to him a blind man. And it's really interesting the way Jesus heals this blind man. And I think it's directly connected to the previous conversation. So in verse 23 and 24, he spit in his eyes, put his hands on him, and asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. And then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and then he stood and saw everything clearly. And so, when we look at this in light of what just happened, some people think Jesus might have messed up the miracle and didn't get it right the first time. I think this was most likely a lesson for his disciples. Remember in the last section, they were just questioning about bread. They couldn't really perceive Jesus. They weren't seeing Jesus clearly. They were concerned about the bread. Jesus says, I'm not talking about the bread. And I'm talking about the deeper meaning of the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees. Beware of their teaching. Now we come to verses 22 and 26. He spit on his eyes and he sees trees, see men like trees walking. That's what the disciples are seeing. They're seeing a surface level view of Jesus, and they're not completely understanding. But what Jesus wants to have happened, and what is going to happen to his disciples, is what happens to the blind man at Bethesda in verse 25. He put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw everything clearly. When Jesus comes in, the apostles were not seeing things clearly, but Jesus stepped in and made this lesson, did this miracle in such a way that got the point across to his disciples that the disciples weren't seeing things clearly, but Jesus is going to make it clear eventually, just like he put his hands and restored the blind man. And one last thing, verse 26, then he sent him away, to his house, saying, neither go into town nor tell anyone. Remember, he's by his hometown, and if if this got word that he's doing miracles, they would put him to death. That would be the threat to the power. So don't tell anyone, which would be hard. We see in chapter 1 when he says that the leopard goes out and proclaims it freely. Because this was awesome. This blind man was blind, but now he could see. And so that would have been hard for him as well. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We are going to be looking at the confession, Peter's confession in 27 to 30 next week. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to being with you all next week, Lord will. See you then. Have a great day.